A warm welcome to our Startup Genome Global Webinar series today on the impact of COVID-19 on our startup ecosystems and insights from that impact. We are trying to quantify, as you know, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. We also try to give a view as to what's happening, to describe the situation and data, and to give you an overview about impact on the one hand side, but secondly also about policies that many of our governments, many of the ecosystems present today have been enacting, and to see how outcomes are. With a brief look on the agenda. So we'll have a brief introduction. We will have a look at the importance of COVID-19 and respective policies. We will seek to understand and quantify the impact. We will work with real data from our startup ecosystems that we have collected in the Startup Genome member network all around the world. And we will, and I'm delighted to say that, devote quite a lot of time today to peer learning with our members. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by Mahinda Herath, CEO of ICTA in Sri Lanka, and Sachindra Samararatne, who's the program head at ICTA in Sri Lanka. I think we will hear about an amazing response, an amazing package of different policy options and other activities with which ICTA has been supporting the Sri Lankan ecosystem. Before we go there though, a brief introduction to our webinar series. This is part of a monthly series that we are conducting since about 2 months. We are trying to address the most tangible, the most important topics that are relevant during crisis, but also post-crisis, with the objective of our objective since we founded Startup Genome, of producing sustainable ecosystem growth and to share that knowledge globally. That's our big mission here, and the webinar is meant to support learning of different topics that are topical to sustainable ecosystem growth. We also want to showcase what we do, but and quite possibly more important, what our partners and our members in the global network are doing in order to accelerate startup ecosystems and startup success. We obviously want to hear your feedback, so let us know what works, what doesn't work, topics we are missing, topics that you like to hear more of. Adam, my colleague on the call here, Director of Business Development at Startup Genome. You can see the email address right now, adam@startupgenome.com. So please direct any questions either to him or to myself. Previous topics, we've been talking about funding policy to startups and scale-ups during the crisis. And we've been talking about options to retain talent, but also to use the crisis in order to attract additional talent to the respective ecosystem and to globally positioning your ecosystem. Topics that are coming are, again, ecosystem growth in general terms and policy impact. That's in the making for this week and obviously for the follow-on webinars. Okay, let's jump right in. Why is this also terribly important? When we look at the startup economy, we believe that the current value created with startups is about $2.8 trillion globally, and that's on par with a large G7 economy. So the impact globally already is massive, and the growth rates over the last years pre-COVID have been colossal, more than 30% a year in value creation. So when you think about that, in 20 years time, you would have the biggest sector in the world to be the startup segment, if you would calculate that way. So it is an economic factor. It is not a small segment in your market. It is from a global basis a veritable and a really significant economic factor. With that importance in mind, what has happened since the crisis? Here are our measurements, and the first one I would always be looking at is what's happening to revenue. Are our startups selling to consumers? Are they selling to businesses, B2C or B2B? And when you look at that slide here, these are global data. It is quite an impressive and obviously also a sad development. When you look here, we got about 52% of all startups that are reporting revenue to be down from 40 to 100%. So that is significant. 40% revenue loss, the green bar here, all the way to 100%, nothing is working. In total, these are 52%, more than every second startup in the world has taken a hit of up to 40% of revenue loss. So that's something we really need to keep in mind when we talk about the ecosystem. The situation at the moment is difficult, there's no doubt. Cash in month to bankruptcy, how much runway, financial runway do our startups globally have? And again, the picture is a difficult one. 41% globally then have less than 3 months or up to 3 months of financial runway. There's even 10% who are running out of money in 4 weeks only. Again, funding, revenue first, funding second. These are things where our startups and scale-ups are struggling at the moment. I'm pretty sure you will not be surprised, but the data is describes it very clearly. Term sheets derailed. What is happening with investors? Again, let's have a look here. 28%, 19 and 9 reports. There's nothing happening to investment discussions I, as a startup entrepreneur, already had with my investor. They've either canceled or the investor has become totally unresponsive. 28%, nearly a third, that are in a situation where they were hoping, rightfully so, to close a funding contract, a deal, and they are not hearing back from their investor. Another 44% who are saying, well, the process has slowed down. And when we talk to our entrepreneurs in person, they say it has incredibly or significantly, it's a better word, slowed down. So the situation, again, is difficult. If you got a month or 2 months or even 3 months of financial runway and something like that happens, you can be pretty sure to run out of money before the next funding round has been closed. So that's something we need to, as ecosystem leaders, as policymakers, we need to keep in mind when we look at our startup ecosystems. Change in VC funding plotted here. COVID is the graph in red, the red line, and these are data from China for all tech sectors, Series A funding rounds. And you can see the very steep drop from 0.0 when COVID hit China to where we are today. And here we've plotted, the blue line plotted the financial recession from 2009, 9-10, with US software startups Series A plus. A different movement, you can see it here. Here's the crisis, 0.0, and we see even a little bit of, we still see funding rounds coming through, but then it really starts to peter out. At the new level after 12 months, it's significantly lower. So if we already have taken a hit like that in China today, that is much worse than what we saw during the last recession. Our prediction, our scenarios do tell us that for the majority of our startups in many markets that have been hit by COVID will not be a pleasant one, and we will see a larger effect than in 2009-10. Yeah. Directly in the peak of the crisis, gap in funding accelerated death of the best startups, the ones that were just negotiating for the next funding round. And when you look in the longer term, so if this happens in a year's time, gap in funding, this is the death of great startups, of a generation of startups that really would have deserved funding but can't access new funding rounds. There's no dry powder capital. That's what we see in VC funding at the moment globally, and using obviously the Chinese data to have a better prediction as to the future. Let's move this on a little bit. The picture is not the same everywhere. Here's our what we call resilience charts, and what we mean is how do different subsectors, all the way from cybersecurity up here to, no surprise, travel and tourism at the end of the list. How are they responding? The question we are asking is, how has revenue changed in these industrial subsectors or startups subsectors? And there are the obvious candidates. We all have gone online. We seek entertainment, we seek education, we seek access to media, all online. They have not benefited, but they have taken less of a hit when you look at revenue development up here. Whilst, and I guess that's no surprise, travel, tourism, beauty, and fashion have taken an immense hit for now, and will be interesting to see how these different sectors and the revenue trends within the sector distribution will develop going forward. Personally, I'm quite convinced that some of the sectors that are at the end of the list at the moment, advanced manufacturing and robotics, for instance, might well see an uplift as we work through the crisis and through the recession. So automation factor productivity may well come back, but that would be my personal view. Why is this so important? Why do we need to discuss these data now? Tech has always been, or traditionally been, historically been, a driver of economic recovery. We should keep that in mind. The data we are showing here is computer systems design related services in the US statistics. And when you look at that, the economic crisis, 2011 to 2015, or post-crisis, 5.9% growth. This is the absolute leading sector all across all industry sectors, and even even later on 15 to 19, 3.6%. So the software sector really is driving economic recovery. It's by far the fastest growing one. So it's important for our economic recovery. It has been traditionally. And also an interesting view when we think about economic recovery, about economic development, we have noticed that what we do call ambidextrous innovation ecosystems perform much better than traditional R&D focused, technology focused ecosystems. Ambidextrous, what do we mean? Ambidextrous for us means there is an R&D capability, great universities, great R&D centers, but there is also a vibrant startup segment that's able to take innovation ideas from a lab into commercial use very quickly, experiment new business models, try it out in the market. And when you look what's happening here, if you go back in time, Seoul, South Korea, Taiwan, they were the leaders in R&D. They still are in technical R&D and patents. But look at economic development, how it has slowed down for these economies. Taiwan, 1.2% from 14 to 16. So the ecosystem, not the ecosystem, the economy really has slowed down. What both Seoul and Taiwan have been struggling with is building these ambidextrous ecosystems. So they were not able in this time frame to build the startup innovation or the startup segment that would help take these patents out of universities into commercial use. For Seoul, that has dramatically changed. I'm happy to say we've seen and reported on the development this year in the GSER 2020. But again, have a look who is really driving economic progress. Silicon Valley, obviously, but also Toronto, Waterloo, with this uni cluster in Vancouver, all have very high economic growth rates and all are archetypes of ambidextrous innovation ecosystems, meaning high patent creation, high academic capability, but also a startup ecosystem that's able to take the ideas from lab to commercial use. And when we look at the results, the startup revolution is driving the most dramatic value creation in history, that's for sure. At the moment, we have 5 of the world's largest companies by valuation, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent, in the global Fortune 500 list. That's an unheard of concentration, and we are not even counting Microsoft or Apple, otherwise it would be 7 out of 10. An unheard concentration of economic value. So again, software is driving economic growth. How do we get to a tech startup ecosystem that is an engine of economic growth and job creation? There are a few facts, a few dimensions that hold true. Pre-crisis, during the crisis, and post the crisis, we believe. The first one is, and I'll explain them in detail, bigger is better. Resources, infrastructure, good policies play an important role. It's not only the private sector. Local connectedness, very much the quality of the community we are working in. Global connectedness, the ability of our ecosystem to exchange ideas with other ecosystems, with other cities, with other regions in the world. And last but not least, global connectedness is a precursor to global market reach, the ability of startups from an ecosystem, from a city, to sell globally, to really realize the potential of global markets. These are the key drivers for ecosystem creation. Bigger is better, I mentioned that as the first statement. And that chart shows you value creation on the vertical and the number of startups, nothing but the number of startups in an ecosystem on the horizontal axis. And what you see, value creation is an exponential process. So doubling the number of startups doesn't double economic value, it quadruples economic value creation. So you go up exponentially as you build your ecosystem. As you start growing, the value you create follows an exponential function. And nearly every ecosystem in the world, we can see the same pattern, the same curve. Having said that, during crisis, the opposite holds true. So the moment you start losing startups because they run out of financial runway, out of funding, because they don't realize revenue anymore, the value creation also reduces on this exponential curve. So it's not, we can't take it lightly. Losing 100 startups is more than just moving a little bit in ecosystem value. It has a dramatic impact depending on where you stand. We always need to keep that in mind. Lots of politicians around the world have looked at saving jobs, keeping economic structures intact, keeping people employed. And we thought to calculate what's the economic cost, what's the cost, not the economic cost, what's the cost for a state, for the taxpayer, to save jobs either in traditional SMEs or in Series A startups, just a comparison. And the fact we come out with with is that it is about 40% cheaper to save jobs in the startup ecosystem as opposed to in traditional SMEs. Quite a steep factor, 40% less. So how many more can I fund if I invest more money into the startup ecosystem as opposed to traditional small and medium-sized enterprises? Entrepreneurship increases during recessions. We've seen that many times over. The big bubble burst in 2000, and then the upcoming recession after. The recession afterwards, and the same in the economic crisis. This is the Kaufman Index for startup activity as a long-term projection. You can see that after every crisis, entrepreneurship picks up. People are seeking new ideas, new opportunities. It might also be entrepreneurship out of necessity because jobs have been slashed, traditional jobs, traditional employment. There are many talented people who are looking for a new opportunity, and many more try to build their own ideas, their own concepts, their own businesses out. So that's what we are looking at, and can only hope that we have the same effect when we work through the current economic recession. Startups, number one of job creation, also something to keep in mind. Interesting here, since 2009 and even before, the red line tells us something about net job creation. Firms aged 0 to 5 years are the only net creators of employment and of quality employment, whilst larger companies, older companies, are net destroyers of jobs. And the explanation obviously is quite clear. Older, larger companies, corporations are looking at factor productivity. They are driving down employment, driving up automation, but they are not creating new jobs and new opportunities to the same degree. So job creation really comes out of these new businesses, out of the startup ecosystem. Incredibly important for policymakers to always keep that fact in mind. Increasing, thinking positively, the size of an ecosystem, what kind of effects can we create? And what we are showing here is a scenario we've recently developed for a client, for an economic ministry of economics, of economic development. And on the left-hand side, we are calculating ecosystem value. This is present day, 1.4 billion US dollars. That's the present day value of the ecosystem we've calculated. And if they would achieve a 5% growth rate, 5% per year, the economic value would go up from 1.4 to 8 billion over 5 years. That's what we've calculated here. This is a 2025 scenario. Starting now, 5% growth every year. Something that's not easy to achieve, but something that's realistic to achieve. Many ecosystems have achieved that level of growth, 1.4 to 8 billion. If they would go up to 10%, we would be looking at 11 billion in economic value created. What does that mean for employment? Let's say the more realistic 5% growth scenario would create an additional 14,000 jobs directly. And our data tell us that every job in the startup ecosystem, in a startup, creates on average a factor of 4 of additional jobs in the wider economy. So direct 14,000, indirect 57,000 jobs created. That's nearly 75,000 jobs created by achieving a 5% growth in this particular ecosystem. That's actually a city here. Just to show the dramatic impact of what can be achieved with a fairly realistic scenario. We're not saying you need to grow 20 or 30% a year. It's 5%. So for us, call to action, it's time to act and save our startup ecosystems so that we avoid, if we think about what happened to funding, Series A funding, in the Great Recession, the financial recession, that we don't come into this death zone where VC funds retract the year after the recession, and 20 to 30% more startups die. That's what we've seen last time. That's something we really want to avoid. So from a policy perspective, we need to ensure that immediate cash is available to startups above the ratio that investors would normally fund to keep them alive. And in this regard, this is a broad approach. Don't pick winners. Just as a policymaker, invest into those that already have gotten funding rounds over the last 9 to 24 months, because they are obviously fundable. A private investor already has promised money, has made an investment, so they are of a certain quality. And secondly, look at those that normally would have gotten funded, these 50% I was talking about in one of my earlier slides, where talks with investors have been delayed, whatever is happening. They also need immediate cash to keep them alive and not to lose this generation of startups. That seems important to us. And last but not that's immediate. Last but not least, when we look at longer term, so in 12 months time, how do we ensure that we don't end up with 20 or 30% more startup and scale-up deaths in the long term? Cash infusions through co-investments seem the much better approach. Fund-of-fund concepts, incentives for larger pension plans, for insurance companies, etc. Great example at the moment discussed or implemented in Israel. These are all concepts that very much look at this part here. How do we long-term, during and post-recession, stabilize investment into Series A+ rounds? Yeah, COVID has dramatically affected startup ecosystems globally, and we believe a targeted focus, responsive focus and support is really required, and we will hear from Sri Lanka how this really looks like in practice. What we want to provide you with are the metrics that allow to design the right responses, but also to measure what is happening during and post-crisis, to adjust your policy measures as you work through the crisis. So being responsive to your startups, to ensure that we don't destroy accidentally what we all have built over many years, invested so much time, so much effort. That's our big ask here. What have we done with COVID-19 impact insights? We are directly analyzing the view of startup founders every month. We collect data globally to understand how's funding, how is revenue, what's happening in your subsector, what's happening to talent, what kind of policies or support do you see? We seek to quantify, you've seen a few sample slides, the impact of COVID-19 on our ecosystems. And we look at a number of key factors, startup factors and policy requirements in an ecosystem in order to have a really comprehensive picture. We've currently analyzed responses against our global startup database, which has millions of data points. We got 3,000 responses from founders globally at the moment in the system, which gives us quite a comprehensive picture already. What are the key areas that we are constantly measuring? Funding, we've seen the impact. Talent and jobs, what's happening to talent retention, termination of staff? What are other labor cost decisions that our startup entrepreneurs are making or are forced to make at the moment, and market impact in general terms? And secondly, the other three, industry impact. You've seen our sector resilience slide, so which subsectors are particularly affected or which ones are faring better and are showing us the way to the future. What's happening from an operational management perspective? What kind of cost-cutting measures, other activities are startup founders and their CEOs contemplating at the moment? And last but not least, but certainly hugely relevant, the impact of policy. What is the impact of good policy on funding, on the survival rate of startups? These are the measures we are constantly looking at and reporting back with our COVID-19 impact report. How does it look like? It's a live dashboard which you can see every day and open up on your browser. These are it comes with impact reports that present the data in a more compressed format. And last but not least, we obviously also operate our vast, our large global member network to share these data, but also to discuss policy measures, to discuss what works and what doesn't work. Live dashboard, here's an example. That's how it looks like, example of London, but let me go into just a few examples, what you really can see. So this would be the reporting from London as one ecosystem. You can, in the COVID-19, in our reporting package, add peer comparison clusters. So here, New Zealand, Oceania, and global as an example to see trends. How are they globally? How are they regionally? How are they in the local ecosystem to have the comparative? For market development, for capital, this is month of runway, discussed that before. What's happening to talent in terms of labor cost and access to full and part-time employment, startups making cuts to their talent base, again, in a peer comparison. These are just a few examples. Oh, what kind of policies are being affected, being implemented? What's the founder's perspective on these policies? Again, here in a comparison between local, regional, Oceania in this particular example, and global trends. Yeah, last but not least, we want to encourage peer learning, and you got access to these discussions with about 74 markets or startup ecosystem clusters. The map is seen here. We are delighted that it has expanded this year, and we hope to be adding even more members to the global network. But to look at this peer comparison and learning, we are learning the most from policy failures and successes. Failures we can only discuss behind closed doors. That's what we are doing today. We are amongst friends, amongst members of the Startup Genome network, so we can be very open and candid, but obviously also about the successes. And I'm really delighted that Mahinda and Sachindra are taking us to what I take as a success for Sri Lanka in managing through the crisis and in also using the startup ecosystem and their many capabilities in direct response for the economy of Sri Lanka, but also for the society of Sri Lanka. And I would say, Mahinda, Sachindra, without further ado, let me hand over to you.
Thank you, Stephan. Thank you both, Stephan and Adam, for having us here. Let me put on the slides.
Sachindra, I'm not sure if you can put them on.
Yes, I think you have to take off.
Just a little moment,
okay.
please. Thank you. That's
okay.
Great.
Can you see my slides?
There we are.
Okay,
thank you very much. Perfect.
So over to Mr. Mahinda.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having us in on this important webinar. I'll be presenting today with my colleague Sachindra, who is mentoring the industry on behalf of ICTA. Before we get on to the discussion per se, I would like to briefly give you an insight to ICTA and ICTA's mandate. Sachindra, yes. ICT actually stands for the ICT Agency of Sri Lanka. It has been created by a parliamentary act, and it is mandated to formulate the ICT policies on behalf of the government and implement the ICT strategies. And actually, if you say in one sentence, ICTA is entrusted with the digital transformation of the country. And ICTA is currently directly reporting to the president of the country. That is from yesterday. So you could see the importance the president has placed on ICT development in the country by directly taking ICTA under his wings. I think I should at this moment quickly say a few words from the president's policy. He was elected last year around November, and he has a policy document, and one whole chapter is on technology-based society. I just pick out some keywords from there. He talks about a technology-based society, a smart nation, a global innovation hub, a citizen-centric digital government, digital inclusive Sri Lanka, and IT entrepreneurship. So you can see where the ICT's mandate comes from. That is why ICT is taking an interest in developing the ICT industry and also the industry related to ICTA. Here I have borrowed a diagram from the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Sri Lanka from ICT report, ITC report rather, published in 2019. You can see the players in the ecosystem. Now all these dots represent universities, incubators, industry associations, so on and so forth. And the size of the dot indicates the influence that particular entity has on the ecosystem. You can see ICTA is clearly standing out. If you have time, you can go through this diagram and get more details. The point I want to press there is ICTA is actually a center point for developing the ecosystem. A quick overview of the economic situation. As 2019, as a country, Sri Lanka has a GDP of 88.9 billion US dollars. Of that, 17 billion was export revenue. And the main export industries have been apparel, transport, and of course, ICT BPM. In 2018, we had around 125,000 workforce in the ICT BPM industry. And the ICT BPM export revenue had been around 1.2 billion out of the 17 billion I mentioned earlier. And we have around 600 ICT BPM companies at the moment in our ecosystem. Very quickly, if I give an insight to our export technology industry, you can see currently only about 5% are related to IP creation and another 30% on high-end product engineering, whereas nearly 65% is on customized software development and business process and software outsourcing. Our intention is to keep this around and have IP creation and high-ended product engineering 60% of our portfolio and 40% for the customized software development and so on and so forth. This is what we are trying to achieve in our industry development program. This diagram depicts how we have been moving in our technology industry growth. You can clearly see there had been 3 waves. The first wave from 2010 to about 2016, which we call the first wave, was mainly focused on outsourcing. Then from 2016 to about 2020, we had a second wave focused on product engineering. And the current wave we have just started from 2020, which will go up to about 2025, is mainly on startup and innovation, where we want to take the industry to 3.3 billion actually. This is again a little insight to the 3 waves I mentioned. If you could look at the slide, you can see there had been a lot of activities since 2016 up to 2020, and a lot of initiatives to prop up the startup industry, a lot of support for the startup industry. So with that, we have been able to actually accelerate the growth of the technology industry. And very quickly, our involvement with Startup Genome, actually ICTA has been working with Startup Genome from 2016. Sri Lanka was featured in the Startup Ecosystem report in 2017. And again, we were featured in 2020. And here we are today contributing to the COVID-19 Startup Ecosystem series. And we are also involved in we have given our support to a survey on the COVID-19 impact on the tech startups in Sri Lanka. Before concluding my segment of the presentation, I quickly want to take 2 snapshots from the global startup ecosystem reports. The first one is from the 2017 report. I just only want to feature one fact there. The ecosystem value had been $32 million in 2017. And if you go to a snapshot from the 2020 report, it has grown to 117 million US. So within 3 years, the ecosystem has grown virtually roughly by 4 times. And before I hand over to my colleague to go into further details on the impact on the COVID-19 on the startups, just I would like to end up showing you the main startup industry verticals. You can see a lot of players in our ecosystem, and the ecosystem is well supported at the moment, and ICTA is driving this. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Sachindra to move on with more insights on the impact of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahinda. Hi everyone, once again thank you for having us here. We are really glad to share our experience of being part of the Genome membership for almost 4 years, and especially this year being a pivotal year on how things are changing over the world. So as soon as Genome
Sachindra, you're breaking up a little bit.
announced that they're doing a survey, understand how they could enter the okay, I'll repeat that. There was very good synergy between Genome and ICTA in terms of what we want to do through a data-driven decision-making process. And with the reports, you will see even what I'm presenting, that every decision that we've taken is based on the data that we gathered through the COVID survey. Starting with this as an example, we realized that 88% of the Sri Lankan startups were facing a red zone, and they had less than 4 months of cash runway. And therefore, we expedited a process that we started back in October to list the startups of Sri Lanka into one platform. The platform is called Startup SL, so that we can funnel all the benefits and the recovery strategies to one particular list, giving tech startups a definition, taking them and or giving them a significant recognition to SMEs in the country. And one of the things that we've done is working with AWS to provide them $1,000 worth of cloud credits to all 270 startups which are registered here. And this became a vehicle for many other entities to support what they call tech startups. Because when we present data, this is the cash flow problem. They say, how can we support? And we say, go to Startup SL. This is a list of companies, and this is how you can funnel your support through them. Spiralation is a tech incubator which ICT has run for almost 10 years. And even this year, we were going to run it the same way, in the same model, supporting companies or supporting budding entrepreneurs to take them from ideation to MVP. And our usual criteria is to support budding entrepreneurs up to 2 years. If it's a startup, up to 2 years. So this year, with this data coming out, that 44% of the startups in Sri Lanka are looking to government to help their company liquidity, and about 81% of startups in Sri Lanka, our markets are either entirely closed or affected significantly. So with this data, we made a significant change in our incubator selection process. We expanded our selection process from startups or budding entrepreneurs for less than 2 years to include startups from 3 to 5 years. For us, this was a significant change, because when we usually get 50 applications, this year we got 117 applications. And this opened up support, taking from what Stephan said, not only to support the budding entrepreneurs, but also support the startups that we have been building all these years, putting a lot of effort to building them to help them survive. So startups which are in the age of 3 to 5 years also applied and have got the grant, they are in the program, and we're able to help them with various needs that they have. We have included our cohort size from 16 to 35. Mind you, this is by keeping being agile as possible with resources that we have, but doubling our numbers, more than doubling to a cohort of 35, and getting support from other organizations like AWS, Facebook, Oracle to utilize their credits, and organizations like Deloitte and the Startup Pitch Contest to open markets, so that the closed markets in Sri Lanka, the companies, the startups will get more opportunities, at least in foreign markets. So we are trying our best possible based on this data to support as much as startups as possible in genome terms to save them, while supporting the new ones who can grow in a post-COVID market to build their MVP. With this data point of understanding that almost 45% of Sri Lankan startups have either laid off part-timers or consultants, or have not been able to pay their salaries in full, we took an approach of working with the government. So this was before ICTA came under the president. We started initiating discussions, dialogues with the government, And now we are in a process of formulating a report to be presented to the president himself on removing all impediments that are there for startups to start and then for them to grow, and also looking at the interesting area of alternative creditworthiness, which we want to debate with banks on how we can provide that support as well. We are also discussing on startup friendly national procurement guidelines, looking at can we give startups exclusive rights to certain government procurements less than a particular threshold. And all of this came into play because we presented this data and the fact that we need to save our startups. We have a goal of having 1,000 startups in our ecosystem by 2024. And this is not only about increasing numbers, but also retaining the startups that we already have. So that was well understood with the data points that we presented to them. And that helped us a lot. We also work with NVQSA is a awards program in Sri Lanka, which for a startup cost about 12,500 to apply, but based with the data being presented, they brought it down to 5,000 rupees. We also work with other funding agencies with this data to get support for startup initiatives. And this is not only happening in Colombo, but also different parts of the country. I've given an example where a business center is being set up in the northern province to support startups there. So the data that was collected helped us a lot for that. Sri Lanka overall handled the situation in a fair manner. And as you see, we also are featured in certain media as handling it well, and some lessons that can be learned through the Sri Lankan ecosystem. And startups at that point onwards were involved with the government, providing tracking applications, providing government notices and other, becoming the one platform which is giving out the notices, providing video consultation, tying up with the Ministry of Health, and providing delivery services. So all the startups, they sometimes pivoted or gave their same service, tying up with government free of charge when during COVID. And there was a good collaboration with the government and startups. And because of the fact that Sri Lanka has or is dealing with the situation in a fair manner, we are positive that our vision of being a digital nomad destination, there is a forecast of 1 billion digital nomads by 2035 could be real. I'll show you one particular example that Sri Lanka was stamped by the Travel and Tourism Council recently, or 2 days back, as a safe travel destination. As you know, Sri Lanka is well known for our beaches, our wildlife, and as a travel destination. So we are stamped travel. So Adam, this is your time to start your plan to come to Sri Lanka. And looking at our telecommunication cost, we are ranked among the lowest in the world. And also in terms of internet inclusivity, the Economist ranks us second best in South Asia, having very good indexes in the e-government survey as well. So creating a conducive environment for startups to come and set up, for entrepreneurs to come and work. And we hope that with the situation become okay, we'll be able to reignite our event, Disrupt Asia, which we want to make it a regional event in the next few years. Very hopeful that we'll be able to do that. And finally, as Mahinda explained, accelerate our progress towards a startup nation by 2025, and really putting in all our efforts during these 4 years to get on, to move on from the activation stage that we are in to the next stage of growth and being featured on Startup Genome, therefore. So thank you for once again for giving us the time to share our thoughts, and I'm glad to take any questions.
Mahinda, Sachindra, first of all, a big thank you for what we find is an incredible story. I mean, I showed you the example of one region, one city we've been working with in terms of economic value creation, ecosystem value creation, job creation, and you demonstrated in Sri Lanka how this really works in practice. It's amazing to see it reflected in your data. I think Mahinda mentioned it. It's the 4th time you've quadrupled already the number or the ecosystem value that you've created over the last few years. So incredible journey. In terms of policy, I really found it interesting to see things like national procurement to be active, because we mentioned it, we saw it in the data. You've taken the absolutely correct clues from it. The drive down in revenue needs to be replaced. We need to have a different client for a certain period of time. And from our perspective, now's the time for governments to use this opportunity and to say, okay, I'm working with my startup ecosystem in order to build a better health system, a better physical infrastructure, a better data infrastructure, a new way to do education, whatever it is. Mobile health, you've shown the example. To use public procurement in this moment of crisis, in this moment of recession, to prop up good startups that are well worthy of saving and revenues is one of the best opportunities. So it's great to see that you're doing this policy, which has not been adopted by too many states. We've recommended it everywhere where we possibly could. The really good ones have put in new procurement rules. Some are struggling because the bureaucracy takes quite long, and that's not good in our startup world. We only get 3 months of funding, but that's fantastic to see.
Thank you, Stephan.
Do we have any questions in the audience at the moment? I actually do already have one from Mutyala Deva Krupa. I hope I'm pronouncing you correctly, from Hyderabad. Mutyala is asking, how can we attract more startups to incubate with us? So Sachindra, you mentioned the global nomads, you mentioned your desire and your push towards attracting more startups to consider Colombo and Sri Lanka as a place to start and to further scale their business. Any particular recommendations you would have?
Thank you
to attract more startups to you. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I understand. So the journey in running an incubator has been long for us since 2010, and how we approached it later onwards is to attract good startups to your incubator. We need to backward integrate and also create a culture of entrepreneurship in your particular state or in your particular city, and then have that connection from the time that they get on to university, that this is where you can end up with. And that's how we were able to create that traction by backward integrating, creating programs with the universities in a local context. In a global context, attracting startups to come and set up, that's something we have emerged on right now, which we want to open up. Up to now, the government grant which is given to startups through our incubator has been for, I would say, domestic companies. But again, in Sri Lanka, if you set up your operation, you can even have 100% foreign ownership, and still you'll be entitled to become a domestic company. So therefore, we have many types of startups, local, homegrown, and those who have returned from Sri Lankans who have returned, who started their businesses, also benefiting from this. So I would say our secret sauce has been backward integrating and connecting with the funnel so that we have the right type of startups to be incubated.
Thank you, Sachindra. And from our perspective, maybe a few words as well. I think there's an element of the general ecosystem. How attractive is it? How strong is your community? How big is the market opportunity? There's also a good argument, and I believe it's at the moment particularly important, around policy. So you mentioned already what you're doing in Sri Lanka in terms of access to public procurement, because that generates revenue. When we see new business models like e-health being active, there are a few requirements. You need to have a digital identity to really make it work. If you want to have private contributions, private payees for a health system to work, insurers, digital identity, payment mechanisms, etc., need to be in place. And to have these basic infrastructural elements or policy elements in place always makes for a really good and attractive market. So there are lots of policy levers that also play a role there. These are the more specialist ones. The more obvious ones are the ability to get a visa, the ability to set up, the ability to connect to revenue opportunity. So things we would normally describe as a very well-rounded soft landing package for a foreign company to easily come in, but also to succeed in creating a real business, creating revenue. Yeah, I got another question from Jack Wang. And Jack, you're asking, what models did we use to work out the indirect employment growth slide, where we said the impact, what's the impact of jobs created in the startup ecosystem, and the ancillary, what's happening in the broader community. Our factor is based on a study one of our colleagues, our chief data scientist, Nabia Morelix, did at Kaufman Foundation. So it's based on US American data. And a survey-based model that allowed us to really get to these leverage numbers here, to say what's the uplift, how many additional freelancers, how many agencies, how many other suppliers for a startup industry are required. I'm based in London. I'm under the same impression that in the city of London we have a factor of 4 or 5. Some Tech Nation, that's the national agency reports, might indicate a similar effect, but nothing as explicit as Kaufman Foundation. So we use this model. I don't know, Sachindra, is that reflected in your environment as well? So we are saying 1,000 jobs created in startups. You will have more freelancers, more agencies, more suppliers, more lawyers, whatever is involved in the ecosystem. So factor 4. Some of our friends in the network say it's almost a factor of 5. Hard to quantify. But does it make sense, or is it completely off?
So for Sri Lanka, since we've been in the technology industry, we started off as an offshore destination. And what we realized is it's a factor of 1 to 3, at least, when we kind of counted it in terms of the direct employment and the indirect employment, because there are offshore companies which are setting up. Our workforce is about 125,000. With startups, knowing this factor of the gig economy and the startup ecosystem coming together, if you look at a startup SL, the listing, it's not only startups, but also freelancers. And these freelancers could be lawyers, accountants, it could be different types of people also listed. So we're providing a platform because we saw that dynamic taking place. We already have lawyer groups which are specifically for startups. They have WhatsApp groups that they consult. It's very interesting how this is the, I would say, the younger generation which have tied up with the whole tech startup wave in Sri Lanka and integrating like this. So I would say indirect employment from the startup ecosystem is, I would say 1 to 4 maybe, like, yeah.
Great, Sachindra, thank you very much for giving us your perspective. I don't see any more questions popping up here. Maybe one sec. No, there are no further questions. Then I would say, as we are coming close to the hour, a very big thank you, first of all, to Mahinda and Sachindra for presenting today what Sri Lanka has done. I think there are some phenomenal policy examples that you have enacted very, very quickly. You've acted as one of the quickest governments we've seen within the network. So big congratulations, and I hope the success continues to pay off for you going forward, but I'm very sure it will. For all of you here, please let us know if there are any questions as to the data, COVID-19 reporting, the data that we are providing. They are available to you on a monthly or 3-monthly basis. So for ecosystems that want to use them to track policy implementation, what's really happening, to have a gauge on what's happening in their environment, please let us know. Happy to help. And for any other suggestions you may have for future topics that are really important to you, things you are thinking about, you want to discuss in a broader context. Also, please let my colleague Adam know, Adam@startupgenome.com, or myself, Stephan @startupgenome.com, and we will bring these topics back to the webinar series for the next iteration in about 4 weeks' time. Thank you very much for participating today. Have a great day and rest of the week. Stay safe. And again, Mahinda and Sachindra, thanks so much for joining us today from Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
Take care.
Bye-bye.